story of William Sampson is extraordinary. He was placed in solitary confinement and was tortured while waiting to be publicly beheaded, having been convicted of a preposterous crime in that nice old progressive Saudi Arabia. And he says that one of the things that kept him going is the cold fury that he feels about the way his case was treated by Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs and the lack of support from the minister of the day. Documents reveal that Sampson repeatedly told Canadian officials that he was being tortured only to have them dismissed as speculative. And in a recent blow, a new blow to his quest for justice and compensation for his horrific ideal, the highest court in Britain, the Law Lords, dismissed his attempt to sue his Saudi captors in England, where they have considerable resources. William Sampson.
There was a quotation that I will try and get right, and I'm also not sure of its attribution. It was said to be from Vladimir Lenin, although quite frankly I don't think the guy ever had the sense of humor to come up with this one. But he said that you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. The big problem is, as I was to find out in December the 17th, 2000, was it's one son of a bitch if you're one of the eggs. It really, really is. Because on the morning of December the 17th, I woke up, proceeded to go to work. I was living in Saudi Arabia, and the secret police, the Mahabeth, lifted me. And there started a cycle of 2 years, 7 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. I have that etched in my mind. I was counting them down throughout the entire imprisonment. Of solitary confinement, physical abuse, and rape. I came to know intimately what torture actually means and what individual acts constitute torture. And I would love to get into a debate on this point with the Attorney General of the United States, or for that matter, the Attorney General of this country or in Britain, because they all seem to want to slim that boundary down and define things like waterboarding as legitimate interrogation. Now, why was I arrested? I was picked up basically because a series of bombings had occurred in Saudi Arabia. And those bombings had injured a couple of British nationals and killed another one. And the Saudi Arabians, in their infinite wisdom, decided what they wanted to do was pin the bombings on some foreigners. As the bombings involved the deaths and injury to Westerners, they nailed a whole lot of Westerners, myself and some colleagues, people I knew that were living in Saudi Arabia who were part of the social scene I was involved in. And so we were lifted, and in my case, within a few minutes of my being arrested, I was being beaten and punched and kicked on the way to the police station. I arrived at the police station. I was handcuffed to a door, upright. And that's the way I've spent the rest of the time at that interrogation center for about 11 or so days. And except during the interrogation sessions when I'd be removed from the door, taken up to an interrogation room, beaten across the soles of the feet, the buttocks, sometimes hung up over a metal bar with the same treatment, beaten across the scrotum. And then around about day 9, somebody decided it was a good idea to rape me. And they did this twice, on the same day, and then the next day as well, as a repeat performance. By the end of this, I provided a false confession. I would have told them that I was Mahatma bloody Gandhi's reincarnation if they'd wanted me to. So they had what they wanted. They had me confessing to being a bomber. They had me confessing to being a British spy. I'm a dual national, British and Canadian, and they wanted, for whatever reason, to have me confess to being a British spy for purposes of leverage, I believe, on the British government. And as a means of also covering up for the fact that they have an internal dissident movement in Saudi Arabia, which in many respects certainly has a lot to dissent about. The Al Saud family has got to be one of the most corrupt and corrupting influences on the face of this earth. Their corruption not only permeates Saudi Arabian society, but the Al Saud family corrupt our own society. Our politicians, many of whom when they retire joined consultancies. Those consultancies do business with Saudi Arabia, incredibly large business with Saudi Arabia. Just to quote a few names, John Major, former British Prime Minister, works for the Carlyle Group, an investment group that has billions of Al Saud dollars in it. He's quite a wealthy man as a result of working for the Carlyle Group. And who are the other people behind the Carlyle Group? The Bush family. Even in Canada, the same thing goes on. So this pernicious influence of the Al Saud family isn't just in Saudi Arabia, and their legitimate descent in Saudi Arabia occurs, but they don't want anyone to know about it, so they have to frame a group of foreigners. This went on for over 2 years. And during that time, the various governments involved, the Canadian was probably the most naive and probably the most stupid and the most culpable of all the governments involved, basically allowed us to rot. They made statements about what they did behind the scenes. They made various palliative gestures towards our families, tried to persuade our families, myself and the other 7 detainees, tried to persuade our families to shut their mouths, not protest, don't make waves, don't make it difficult, it'll only make things more difficult for your family members. Well, I'm here as living proof that if you don't make waves, your family member in such a situation is going to disappear. Because what I eventually faced would have been death by al-had, a form of execution in which your head is partially severed from your body and you are affixed to a cross and left to die. And it takes a few hours to die in that method. And I have no doubt that if it hadn't been for my family members, for the profile that my family and friends kept with the governments, the Saudi Arabians may well have done that to me. And I also know if they'd done that to me, they'd have done exactly what they're doing for Stefan Hashemi now. Not even thinking about pursuing justice for the death of Zara Kazmi, a Canadian journalist who was killed in Iran. They've done nothing. Nothing effective for that man. And they would, if I had been killed in a Saudi Arabian prison on false charges, done exactly the same thing. It turned out that that was a rather large lie. What they were doing was they were attributing the intelligence that they gathered from the network of informers to the people that they'd been torturing.
The brain power in this room could levitate this place. And it's like, wow, look, you know, who's here. And it was just so exciting.
So it was with absolute horror that I arrived out of my prison cell after about 2 years. 2 years, as I said, 7 months, to discover that some of the principles that I held as inherent in Western society, inherent in the Western judicial system, were under onslaught because of a gross act of terrorism on 9/11. Somebody had suspended the idea of a speedy trial in Britain and Canada. A gulag had opened up in Guantanamo Bay. I then had to be exposed to the images of Abu Ghraib, where, quite rightly, a few American soldiers have finally been punished for that. But I'm still waiting to see the general stand trial for that, because they would not have been behaving like that without orders, without tacit consent and instruction from their superiors. And the evidence is there that that has happened. And as I came out of prison, I found that there were people being held in detention in this country, classified as terrorists. And they may well be. I'm not going to get into the guilt or innocence of people that we have security certificates on. But the fact of the matter is that these people are sitting there. They have no right, their advocates have no right to see the evidence that is held against them. A security certificate has been issued, and that is it. I'm sure Mr. Kotler can bring me up on correct me on some of the finer points of this. But the only thing that has been heartening to me is, during this time, one country in this has had a judiciary that has had the moral backbone to throw out those laws as a violation of its constitution or its effective common law and the European Charter of Human Rights. And that was the Law Lords in London. Now, they've denied me the right to sue my captors, but they, at least over the last 2 years, have thrown out unlimited detention without trial. And have also thrown out the idea that those accused of crimes of terrorism do not have the right to see the evidence. They have also thrown out the idea that evidence that is brought against an individual can come from a source in which torture has been used. Because the problem is that a number of Western countries now have adopted an attitude of don't ask, don't tell. Somebody provides them with intelligence gathered in a place such as Afghanistan or Tajikistan or Kazakhstan. In Kazakhstan, for instance, one of their popular methods of torturing people is to boil them alive. The evidence, as I said, gathered by those means can then be used in our courts. Except last October in Britain, thank God, the law lords turned around and sort of said, hang on a second, provenance of such evidence needs to be checked. We will not accept that our own officials conduct torture, and we will not allow torture in our own country. We're damn well not going to accept evidence that has been obtained by torture elsewhere. And that is a great ruling. The problem is that this debate still rages. Many countries still do not recognize the invalidity of evidence gained by torture and still happen to believe that it should be used in a court of law, that it should still be used to lock people up without trial. And one of the reasons for this is that people, many senior people in our governments and our intelligence networks, actually believe that torture is an effective intelligence gathering tool. Now, I'm not going to stand here and say that torture will not get some valuable information. I know that when the Saudis tortured me, as I said, I'd have told them I was Mahatma Gandhi if necessary. And if they'd actually ever been after some real information from me, maybe I would have given it. But the problem with the effectiveness of torture is that in reality, if you don't know what it is you want to ask the person in the first place, what you will get from that person is a false confession. And so say you arrest 10 people, you torture 10 people. One of them is the person you're looking for, the others aren't. The problem is you will now have 10 criminals because they will all confess. They will all confess to different things and all confess to what they think you want to hear. So in the midst of that mess, where you might have one small grain of truth, you end up with a morass of bad information which you then send your operatives out, your intelligence operatives out checking out. It has long been known that the most effective method of fighting terrorism, of gathering intelligence, is not hanging someone upside down and beating the crap out of them until they beg for mercy. It is by penetration agents. The British government in the Second World War was exceedingly successful. They started off with something called the London Cage, which is actually a place where a lot of brutal torture occurred on potential German on people they thought were German spies. They dumped that approach when they found that tea and sympathy was a more effective means of getting intelligence out of them. And they also came up with a slightly brutal but a little bit more civilized method of dealing with the spies. And they said, you have two choices. You either become a double agent for us, or we shoot you. And they had remarkable success with that. At least it was fair. They weren't torturing the people anymore. They said, you've been caught as a spy. International law allows us to execute you. So that's what's going to happen. Or you can work for us. And the result of that was they actually turned the entire intelligence network that Germany had stuffed into Britain on its head. That was the most effective means of their gathering intelligence, of knowing what the Germans were up to within the British Isles during the Second World War. And time again, this is shown to be the case. One of the greatest series of studies that advocated that torture is a good intelligence gathering method comes out of the Algerian rebellions during the 1950s, when the French used their Foreign Legion paratroopers to brutalize huge segments of the cities in Algeria, and to use interrogation methods which were as bad, if not worse, than anything I went through. And the French then justified and went around lecturing at this place such as the School of Americas, the intelligence school in the United States, was lecturing to the CIA, lecturing even to the British intelligence, how effective their methodologies were. It turned out that that was a rather large lie. What they were doing was they were attributing the intelligence that they gathered from the network of informers to the people that they'd been torturing, because otherwise they had been doing something which was morally reprehensible, potentially a criminal act even under French law at that time, and Algeria at that time was French territory, and therefore they had to have a justification for it. And time again, every time I go over any of this material, review any of this, I find that when torture is discussed as an adequate intelligent method, when I look deeper into it, what happens is the torture is being used to justify, the intelligence that's gathered is being used to justify the torture that took place. But oftentimes, in every case that I've looked at, even including some of the people who've been arrested concerning 9/11, the torture, the information that was gained, claimed to have been gained out of them by coercive interrogation or torture, actually came from other sources and was then attributed to them, or was confirmed by them, i.e. the interrogators effectively went in and said, we know what you did, and the guy eventually said yes. But they didn't need to torture him to get that because they already had the information from another source. Canada, the United States, Britain are actually in collusion with the very governments that practice torture. And they keep saying they don't believe in it, but then they argue that they do.
What happens every single time I come is that I run the full gamut emotionally. I mean, half the time I'm laughing uproariously, and the other, I'm in tears half the time too with some of these profound stories.
One of Canada's leading intellectuals has taken the following stance on this. And this is where I want to quote something for you. And it says, while some abuse and outright torture can be attributed to the sadism of individuals, poor supervision and so on, it must be the case that other acts of torture occur because interrogators believe, in good faith, that torture is the only way to extract information in a timely fashion. It must also be the case that if experienced interrogators come to this conclusion, they do so on the basis of their experience. The argument that torture and coercion do not work is contradicted by the dire frequency with which both practices occur. That is about similar to saying, let's go accuse someone of being a witch. If they float, they must be a witch, so we can burn them. And it's a practice we should still keep going because, hey, we did it for centuries. It must have worked. I mean, God, we found a lot of witches. Because the logic is circular and flawed. It's based upon the prejudice which so many people seem to have, and that is that torture can work. Well, I know it doesn't. I know from experience it doesn't. But what's even worse is the fact that there's a series of theories out there. Alan Dershowitz's ticking bomb theory. For one, i.e. that if you have information that is necessary, that if somebody has information about a bomb that's about to go off, you are justified in brutalizing them. Now, I am a practical man. I don't have a particular problem with engaging in certain morally repugnant acts if they will serve the greater good. I consider that war is a morally repugnant act, yet I know that it was necessary to fight in the Second World War. And I would have done so. Members of my family did. But torture is another matter. And to believe that torture is actually going to get you to the truth and that you can engage in a morally repugnant act and justify it because it's going to give you the truth that you're going to get timely information about a bomb that's just about to go off is a fallacy. Why? Because people who are being tortured can resist for a few days, and if the timing is that critical, you're going to mess up in the first place. Secondly, unless you already know that what you're looking for and you know that you've got the right person, which you don't in these circumstances, you're going to be making a mistake. But worse is that still continuing acceptance of torture as an effective means of intelligence gathering. Because another quote from the same individual, if they are right, then those who support an absolute ban on torture and stress and duress had better be honest enough to admit that moral prohibition comes at a price. It is possible, at least in theory, that subjecting interrogators to rules that outlaw torture and coercive interrogation, backed up by punishment if they go too far, will create an interrogation regime that allows some interrogation subjects to resist divulging information and to prevent our intelligence services from timely access to information that may save lives. Frankly, that is the biggest load of bullshit I have ever had to read in my life. If the information is that time sensitive, any experienced military interrogator will tell you you're not going to get the information out of them by torture. Yet, if you torture them, you're also going to get bad information, which is going to lead you to the wrong place. And if you know you've got the guy, as I've already said, and I will keep saying, if you know you've got the guy in your hands, and you know what he's done, you don't need to torture him. And yet our governments justify it. And yet our governments sign treaties like the United Nations Convention Against Torture, but refuse to support the victims of torture such as myself. They engage or assist in the rendition of suspects. They arrest somebody in London, and that person may find themselves in Guantanamo or in Kazakhstan. They lift somebody at an airport in Nigeria. He ends up being flown to Guantanamo, then back to Egypt. Transited through countries like the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Sweden, France, Spain. All of these countries operate in a culture of denial on this issue. They claim not to torture. They claim not to believe in it. But behind the scenes, they say, oh, there are special circumstances. And then indulge in the practice of illegal, extraordinary rendition. And then claim that they don't. While at the same time leaving people such as myself, James Cottle, Alexander Mitchell, Mohammed Beg, and others to have to bear the physical scars of their mistaken policies and their refusal to properly deal with those countries that practice torture as a regular right. And many times they're able to practice it as a regular right because our own countries, this country, Canada, the United States, Britain, are actually in collusion with the very governments that practice torture. And they keep saying they don't believe in it, but then they argue that they do. And I personally wonder at what point the citizens of our countries are going to wake up and realize that in your name, unspeakable acts of barbarity are being condoned, are being undertaken. They don't make you safer. They don't protect you against acts of terrorism. They don't add to an accurate intelligence picture about what is going on amongst our enemies or those that wish to harm us. What they do is they morally harm our society. They act as a recruiting drum for those that actually want to attack us. And they show the hypocrisy that we live in our societies. Not a particularly pleasant topic for this early in the morning, but it's also not particularly pleasant for the thousands of people I know that I've left behind. I'm free. I got drunk as a skunk last night, all right? But I also know right now there is someone chained upright, bleeding, and somebody may be justifying it in your name. Thank you.